Good day and welcome to Glasnost in our time, where we try to look at the world rationally in the hope that it will look rationally back. I'm your host, Anthony Dagostino. It's November 16th, 2023. Israel is bombing Gaza relentlessly. Israeli troops are at the edges of the city, but they can hardly find any Hamas forces to destroy. Hamas does not fight. It only makes ambushes. Israel is finding that its tanks and tank dozers can be knocked out by locally produced anti-tank weapons. The Israeli fight to destroy Hamas may be turning out to be a blind alley. We will see. The world is erupting with demonstrations against the bombing. Words like genocide and ethnic cleansing are becoming common in talking about Israel. U.S. forces in the region are at the mercy of events. Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen are doing a lot to anger Israel. They can also provoke the U.S. forces. The U.S. wants to keep others out of the war. Does it want to be provoked into war? And war against whom? Against Iran? The war in Ukraine is in a stalemate, and Zelensky is purging his military. U.S. forces are hinting that there will be an end to U.S. military aid. It's time for peace, one would think. But can Ukraine get this peace from a fully mobilized Russia? Can Joe Biden win an election as a war president? To judge by the polls, Trump can defeat him. And if Trump returns, he will apparently be bearing a sword and wanting to overthrow the government, root and branch. Only Biden, burdened by his two wars, can stop him. But how? One would think that perhaps he can end his passivity by becoming a peace president. Well, at any rate, the MAGA trend is still robust, and if you read about it in the business press, you'll usually see it described as a kind of populism, so-called. This is a term that is often used to describe a range of parties and movements of the right and left. Those who use the term seem to know what they mean by it, but one could ask the question whether they really know what they're talking about. Is populism a useful term, or is it, as our guest, the historian Charles Postel, thinks, an analytical pop gun? Analytical pop gun. Postel is the author of an award-winning study of the subject, The Populist Vision, published by Oxford in 2007, and more recently, Equality, An American Dilemma, 1886 to 1896, published in 2019 by Farrar and Company. It's Farrar, Straus, and I forgot who, but at any rate, Charles will fill us in on that. He teaches history at San Francisco State University. He's been writing a series of interesting articles on the current uses of populism in talking about politics today. So welcome to Glasnost, Charles Postel.
Thank you, Tony. Glad to be here.
So I think a lot of people are used to thinking about the political spectrum of a democracy as having liberals and conservatives sort of around the center. And as you go out to the left, you have socialists, communists, anarchists, the far left, you might say. As you go out to the right, you might have, ultra-conservatives, clerical authoritarians, fascists, that sort of thing. And that's the way I was taught that the political spectrum pretty much shapes up. But nowadays, one would almost get the impression that this word populism covers almost everything, and that it changes all our previous thinking about the political spectrum. What do you think about this topic in general? Where does populism, or how does populism change our views about the political spectrum?
You know, the term populism with a small p is really an invention of social scientists around the 1950s, early Cold War years. Richard Hofstadter, the historian at Columbia, he was the one who sort of gave its widest exposition of this notion of populism with a small p. But it was followed by a whole series of people in political science and other disciplines, and they did exactly what you're describing. They're saying American democracy, or democracy anywhere, is defined by these very small, narrow visions of what historians have described as consensus history, whereby you agree with a sort of a liberal centrist vision of how the country works. And that's what's American, that's what's democratic, that's legitimate politics. And then anything to either right or left of that was dangerous politics, right? In exactly the way you're describing it. And so for Richard Hofstadter, he did this amazing thing with populism. Populism in the United States before Hofstadter was essentially was connected with the People's Party of the 1890s, which was a farmer labor revolt against corporate power, the strongest third party in the history of the United States since the Civil War. And this populism was essentially what we would just think of as a social democratic farmer labor movement that gave rise to essentially the farmer labor and social democratic politics of the 20th century. But in Hofstadter's hands, he said, oh no, populism in the 1890s soured, morphed into the McCarthyism, the intolerance, the anti-Semitism, the fanaticism of the 1950s, of the far right. So populism is this dangerous thing. If you get out of the center that you've described, if you get out of the liberal consensus center, then you get into this range of populism, which can phantom-like transform itself from the left to the right. And the cornerstone of this ideology, of this thinking about populism, is condescension towards mass politics, or of any type. It's when the masses get involved in politics, they get dangerous. And so that's why journalists, editors, social thinkers are so enthusiastic to take up this word populism, because instead of analyzing, for example, Donald Trump's movement, the MAGA movement, as a right-wing nationalist movement directed by billionaires, tech bros, military generals, corrupt politicians, which of course it is. Instead, it's something from the masses being engaged in politics is where we're getting MAGA from. And that's why they like to use the term. And so my own view is that people have come up with many types of definitions of populism, what they mean by small p populism. And I reject all the definitions. I think they're all nonsensical and contradictory. For me, populism is the farmer labor politics of what came out of the 1890s. Makes sense to describe it because they call themselves populists. The rest, I think we should use old words like the words you were using. Fascists. I mean, I listen to Trump speeches these days. It sounds a lot like a fascist to me. We're going to exterminate the vermin in our ranks, in our internal society. That sounds pretty fascistic to me.
Yeah.
I don't see why we would call that, connect that to the farmer labor social democrats of the 1890s. I think that's absurd.
Charles, even so, don't we have to explain this mass support for politics of the right?
Of course.
Into that idea. I know that the fascist movements in the 20s and the 30s, they had mass support too.
Of course they did.
And
yes.
anybody who talks nationalism, of course, has mass support. But don't we have to say more about this constituency for the far right?
Well, I think there are two pieces of that. One piece of that is, of course, the nationalism by definition is cross-class. Obviously, it is. Right. That's one thing. The second thing is the MAGA movement and the conservative organizations that have, spawned it and promoted it. These are people like Peter Thiel. These are the richest, most powerful people in the world are supporting these MAGA phenomenon. And we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't, that we shouldn't forget that they have that going for them. The other thing I think is, I mean, I study rural politics, and an important thing to think about in terms of understanding rural politics is think about it this way. In the populist era, the people who the populists hated most, the farmers and laborers who made up the populist coalition, were the local businessmen, the local merchant who gouged them, the local political rings who were tied to banks and creditors. It was these local rural land speculators and realtors and contractors. That was their main enemy. And that the social base of the opposition to populism were these rural local businessmen in the towns, in places like Kansas. That's where the most right-wing, anti-populist, anti-social democratic politics came from. And I think it's important to think of when we think of sort of the rural shift um, to MAGA nationalism. Yes, it's very rural, but the core of rural support that makes it really strong is the local car dealerships, the local contractors, the real estate speculators, the machine dealers, all of these people who have their corollary in the anti-populists of the 1890s now dominate in these rural places. And one of the reasons why they can dominate in the way they do is many of the laborers who were pro-populist back in the 1890s are now were white. They may have been immigrants, but they were white and they could vote. And many of the rural laborers today in places where MAGA movements are strong in rural places are immigrants who are disfranchised. And this is a really important thing to think about in terms of the rural urban divide in the MAGA movement.
How about the this idea of nationalism now? I mean, you make it out that it's very much a revolt against the small proprietors and local elements. That it's very much kind of a creature of local. But when you say nationalism, don't you automatically start to say economic nationalism? I'm certain Pat Buchanan definitely thought of it that way, and I think of as Donald Trump is getting most of his ideas from Pat Buchanan, and Pat Buchanan is just plying this well-worn kind of line about economic nationalism, which has certain obvious components. It has a tariff policy associated with it. It's an attitude toward finance in general. So in conjunction with this, don't you think that we ought to try to explain, or the historian ought to try to explain, why it was that populism in the 19th century ended up in the Bryan campaign, and that turned out to be a campaign for cheap money, for silver, against the gold standard, against presumably rational finance.
Right. Yeah. Well, there are many parts of this. I hope we made it clear. I'm talking about the local businessmen are Trumpist, are MAGAites, and why that is. There are many pieces of that why they would support this economic nationalism. I do think we need to remember that at the bottom line of the MAGA movement is just violently anti-labor politics. I mean, think about at the heart of the climax of the pandemic crisis, the one emergency measure the Trump administration took was preventing workers in the meat plants from gaining protections from the law. That was the one measure it took. So I don't think we should ever forget how just virulently anti-labor these people are. The anti-immigration campaigns are really fundamental to this sort of rural petty capitalist world. If you're a landscape contractor and you have 50 employees, 45 of them are going to be undocumented workers. And to vilify the undocumented, to harass them, to bully them, to prevent them from having rights, is so fundamental to their business model. Those business models don't work if those people have rights and can be paid decent wages and have benefits and things of that nature. So for these people, these are fundamental things that are not abstract from their business models. And I think we shouldn't. And the main thing is, if we think about anti-immigrant, it's connected to a virulently anti-labor agenda. These things are connected.
Okay, we can pursue these things, and I guess maybe we will as we go on. But
yeah, they're important. They're good.
I wanted to ask you something about the terms before we get really rolling with this. Yasha Munk wrote an article a few years ago for Foreign Policy, if I remember correctly. It's called "Pitchfork Politics." It's pitchfork politics. Will that kill, or is that a threat to liberal democracy? Now, what do you think of those two terms? Pitchfork politics on the one end, liberal democracy on the other. Is that a useful way to look at things?
When the Tea Party emerged during the Obama years, the Tea Party emerged after the financial crisis, and this was a movement funded by the Koch brothers, rolling out fury that the government might provide some support for distressed homeowners, just people with distressed mortgages. They were just enraged at the idea that the government might assist these people. And I think it's the March 2010 issue, or maybe of Time magazine, and the headline is "Populist Anger," and it showed a picture of people with pitchforks and torches, and of course it's very scary. And of course the picture, of course, has nothing to do with populism. It was a picture from the movie Frankenstein, right? and then it had all these sage people explaining what populism is and how dangerous it is when masses get involved in politics and anger takes over. When the Tea Party, if you break it down, this was the self-activation of the old John Birch Society cells, mobilized with a lot of Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute money. That's what the Tea Party was. I'm not denying that it had a certain popular enthusiasm, but the organizational structure and the impetus and the politics of this thing, remember, they were clamoring for the gold standard. They wanted the gold standard up and down the line. The Tea Party wanted, and in fact, in certain states, they even enacted measures to restore the gold standard as legitimate as currency in Georgia and Texas.
So that's the opposite of the populist movement.
They're the opposite of the populists and everything they stood for.
Yeah.
And it's also insane, but yes.
It's a revolt for dear money.
It's a revolt for dear money. Exactly. It was a revolt for dear money. And anyhow, so at that time I was receiving phone calls like editors from the New Yorker, can you explain this populist revolt because you wrote a book on populism? And I said, I could, but the book I wrote had nothing to do with these people. These are the anti-populists. This is the opposite of populism. Yeah. They've never accepted that, and they keep writing their nonsense about pitchfork politics.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I get the feeling when we're talking about populism, we're talking about this problem of the decline, if you accept this idea, the decline of social democracy. I think I get the impression that you in your work, you want to clean up this idea, or at any rate, make much more simple this idea of social democracy. And you consider it a basically coherent, sound idea with a certain tradition behind it, and et cetera. But okay, so even if we accept that, don't we have to say that it's really been having just a terrible, terrible time of it in the last 30 or 40 years or so, a real decline in social democracy? And doesn't that help to explain why it is the the constituency of social democracy is open to appeals from the right?
I think this depends on where you're looking and how you understand it. I mean, in the American context, you have this phenomenon where, for the first time in really my lifetime, which is, I'm old now. This is a long time. We have a sort of a social democratic caucus in the American national legislature, which is relatively powerful. It's led by Bernie Sanders, a self-described socialist. Yes, he worked within the Democratic Party, and you could say, well, this is a watered down socialism or a weakened social democracy. Yes, yes. But as far as a articulate, yes, the idea that some type of social democracy is a good idea. When did we have that? He almost won the Democratic primary. And he's not only that, he's one of the most powerful senators in the United States. This is a strange thing. And yes, we have the Biden administration is a war president, and he's supporting genocide and the unbelievable destruction. And but in economic terms, social policy, a lot of what he's doing has been driven by the Bernie Sanders wing of that party. So I'm not sure that it's right to talk about the death knell here. Now, Europe is much more complicated in this regard because, I don't know fully how to articulate it, except that social democracy won in Europe, unlike in the United States. Social democratic policies in terms of healthcare and health and social insurance and other things broadly won by the late 20th century. And it's interesting to me that the first real serious breach in the sort of centrist consensus in Europe took place in Austria in 1999 with the victory of the Freedom Party there. And there was no immigrant influx into Austria. There was no breakdown of the social democratic order in Austria. It was one of the most egalitarian sort of social distribution countries in Europe. So why is it that that's the first place the neo-fascist party gained entry into government? I think it's more complicated than simply the collapse of social democracy. I think it's connected to actually the triumph of social democracy and the inability to maintain political life that's people can find rewarding and attach themselves to. That's I think partly the lesson of Austria in 1999.
I'm not sure I get that. You say it's because of the triumph of social democracy, and Austria is the home of virtually all the right-wing trends in economics and in politics as well.
Well, in terms of the basic structures of social insurance, housing, social housing in Austria is probably the most advanced of any country outside of, I don't know, Singapore or someplace. Social housing is extraordinary. Social goods are extraordinary. I mean, yes, you could maybe Sweden competed with it at that time, no longer. But those are the
maybe that's our explanation. Maybe that the reaction to that.
Well, the problem is that the very beneficiary, as you would say, the very beneficiaries of this system did revolt against it, and that's one of the really interesting things to think about. Why is that? In other words, what I'm trying to do here is pose. I do not think that this type of politics is simply a result of the triumph of neoliberalism. That's how it's often read. There's this triumph of neoliberalism. The Social Democrats went neoliberal. They they dismantled the social safety net, and so they disillusioned the workers, and so the workers went over to Le Pen or to right-wing nationalism.
That's just what I was going to say.
But it's what I'm saying is
Well, that's all wet, you think?
well, it's not entirely wet, but it misses the fact that of that in some of the very places where the social safety net wasn't dismantled is some of the places where social democracy remains strongest. These politics gained their first major foothold. So I'm not sure that it can be explained that way. I think there are political reasons. There's the dysfunctions of the EU, for example, are powerful political incentives for this type of politics. But it can't just be the dismantling of the social democratic order by neoliberalism. It has to be more than that. Now, in France, yes, the Socialist Party collapses with its successful dismantling of much of the, with the depths of neoliberalism. But I'm still not persuaded about the economic links between these politics and are these politics of distress? I'm not convinced of that.
That's a lot to think about.
Well, I'll give you another example, Tony, and you may know this better than I, but think about Poland, where you have this right-wing authoritarian politics is very strong current. No economy in Europe has been as successful as Poland in the last.
Yeah.
Yes, there's inequalities there, but the general phenomenon is upward and over anything they've ever had before.
Yeah.
Poland's never been so rich.
Mm-hmm.
The EU has poured hundreds of, billions and billions of euros into Poland, and yet you have this nationalist right-wing politics. So I am one of those people who distrust this correlation. I'll give you another example. In the United States, what were the years where the Ku Klux Klan controlled state legislatures in dozens of states and had a couple dozen Klansmen in the U.S. Senate? It was the 1920s, the year of America's greatest prosperity ever, up to that point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just the idea of economic stress as the source of these politics. Yes, there's always economics, always work in politics, but I don't think they work in the straightforward way that we often imagine.
No, absolutely not. And there's a Thomas Frank, isn't that his name? What's wrong with Kansas? Thomas Frank.
Right.
There's a Thomas Frank kind of argument, and if I may vulgarize it and extrapolate it a little bit, it sort of says that the right hasn't got much of an economic argument to run in elections, and so it needs to find other ways.
Right.
I think there's a kind of a notion in our minds that this is a very artificial idea, that politics is all based on class. It's all economics. All you have to do is talk economics and you'll win, and et cetera, et cetera. But don't you think that's kind of a shallow conception of economics? When you constitute a party, automatically you're talking about taking your constituency and developing policies toward everybody else, the outside. Number one, foreign policy.
Yeah.
Number two, if you're in a democracy, it's policies toward the other classes in the democracy to whom you have to appeal. So ipso facto, the minute a left-wing party enters politics, it has to start thinking about immigration. It has to think about it not necessarily in a class way with a class reflex, but in terms of some kind of general program that it can win with. And it has to approach essentially all these questions. Culture, immigration, and especially economics, protectionism, protectionism.
Yeah.
So it's the natural thing.
Right.
In democracy.
Well put. Yeah.
You agree with that?
I agree.
So social democracy then, does it have a foreign policy?
Well, that's, to me, that's one of the crises that social democracy face, very seriously in Europe. I think that is one of its serious problems. Um, I don't know if you've been watching the Labour parties, in Britain, which I'm not sure how much of it is social democratic any longer, but to the extent that it is, I mean, is it a imperial war party, or is it or is it something that has something to do with humanity? I don't know.
Yeah,
I
but I
guess,
think that because of the Procrustean bed in which it has to,
yeah,
on account of the ingenuity of the right. I
right,
mean, we really must appreciate that.
yeah,
there really is
right,
quite resourceful in creating problems for.
right, right. And we have the same thing in the United States. I mean, I'm singing the praises of the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, but they're also stuck with a foreign policy conundrum, which they don't know how to get out of. Which
And
is which
where
is
does this? Why is this reflex so necessary to Sanders? I don't think it would be. I mean, suppose
oh, I agree with you, but he sees it. He
agree.
sees it. He doesn't want to have a rupture with Schumer. He needs to work with Schumer, and Schumer is a strong pro-imperialist politician.
Yeah.
And so um, Sanders wants to be able to work with him, and so he doesn't. No, I'm not going to call for a ceasefire because it would anger my allies. So that's Sanders' problem right now.
Yeah, but
Um,
there used to be a politics that prevailed for a while in the United States after 1968, politics of solvency. Bill Bundy and people like that, they had the editorship of Foreign Affairs, and you saw a lot of very sensible articles about foreign policy, about détente
yeah,
and things like that. And I think of the Nixon-Kissinger détente as being in tune with that.
mm,
If you espoused the politics that, and as a matter of fact, it used to be the politics of the Republican Party, if you espoused a kind of attitude toward foreign policy that you shouldn't be so dogmatic, we shouldn't be so reflexive, we should think of things carefully, prudently, think in terms of solvency, that is to say, don't do things that can't be done,
right,
etc. The way the Republican Party used to talk, and I'm not talking necessarily about the Republican government of those years, Nixon and Kissinger, but about the way the party, the dialogue in the party went, and the national dialogue. Some social democrat could espouse an attitude toward foreign policy sort of like that, it strikes me, and that would make perfect sense.
right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do, and I think that AOC and others actually have a foreign policy that I think is sort of pragmatic and realistic and makes sense, and you know it sounds to me plausible. And I think the sooner that that aligns with the broader spectrum of our politics, the more reasonable this country's going to become. I don't know. That's my hope.
Okay, let me ask you a really perverse question. I get to do this on this.
Yeah, perverse. Go.
This is really perverse. You have a gig. Let's assume you have a gig. You're talking to a chamber of commerce, or maybe an audience of notables.
Yeah.
Okay? Audience of elites, notables, high-powered audience, readers of foreign affairs, people who read the Atlantic Monthly. This is the audience, and it's a very high-powered audience. Could you make the case to them that, look, you people have an interest in a healthy, vibrant social democracy? Now, I'm not just talking about saving the institutions of democracy,
Right.
not just talking about liberal democracy, but I'm talking about social democracy. You guys have an interest in promoting that, and not letting our dialogue get so crude as it is at the moment. You think you could make that argument?
I'm going to make this. I'm going to sidestep the
Or would
direct
you want
answer.
to?
I'm going to sidestep the direct answer. I lived in Germany for a year, and I had occasion to have some business dealings and social dealings with a Texas millionaire, Texas capitalist, who was from West Texas, where he made his money in oil drilling equipment. And he used to, I was living in Baden-Württemberg, and he said, there's nothing worse than this place. It's like the Marxists control it. The unions and the Marxists control everything. They, everything is regulated. All the wages are set. You can't fire anybody. You can't turn anybody out of the apartments because the contracts. All this social democratic stuff it's just pure. It's just Marxist hell. And I asked him, so why do you live here? And he says, what? You want me to live in West Texas? The relative social.
That is an answer. That's an answer.
The relative social cohesion, the relative lack of crime and violence, the city parks, the ability to sit, the culture of leisure, the culture of the educational levels of the population, the cleanliness of the city. You name everything is nicer in that town where he lives in Baden-Württemberg. There's nothing like that in Texas, not even close. There's nothing like it. So that would be my argument.
That is a great answer. Okay, as long as we're on the asking perverse questions, let me continue. Suppose you got a chance to address a group of AFL-CIO tops and national union heads of the unions throughout the country, real leaders of the working class, you could say, and you were addressing them on the topic of immigration.
Yeah.
What attitude should the United States take toward its southern border, for example?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is, since I've been alive, the movement of the unions on the question of immigration has really been, to me, an inspiration. It's been a hope. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Cesar Chavez was denouncing wetbacks and the need to drive out the undocumented from the Southwest. That was Cesar Chavez. And of course, whether you're talking about Teamsters or all the other unions were much worse even. And that whole game is up. And now you have unions like the SEIU and others, major unions, really taking I consider at least plausibly reasonable attitude that no, these are working people that should be embraced by unions, and we should organize them and protect them to as much as possible, because protection of the immigrants helps protect all workers. So that's a step that you find in the union movement today that I think is really remarkable. It's hard to find bright spots on the American social terrain, but that's one. And on the question of the border itself, it's complicated. I'm one of those people who believes we should have a very liberal immigration policy. We need to have a large number of immigrants just to keep for the well-being of our own country, but also just humanity's sake. It's the right thing to do. But it's also a good thing to do. It makes our country richer. It makes our country better. Not that I'm a nationalist in that way, but
Charles, are there any limits to it though?
Well, I think that there are some things. I think that the system of illegal or undocumented immigration creates a two-tiered society that's very harmful.
Yeah.
So we do definitely need to create some structure where you're here, you're a citizen. Now that's the way it used to be in the 19th century. That's the way it used to be. You come to the United States, you live here in some places, even if you arrive, boom, you have citizenship rights in terms of voting and everything else. except in federal elections. But then, then you get federal elections very soon after that. So it used to be wide open. You come here, you're a citizen. That was basically how it worked, as long as you were white. There was of course, since 1790, it was only white people got that. I'm not sure that that would work today. I think that with global climate change, we'd have, several billion people knocking on our door very quickly if we did that. Nonetheless, I think that we need to restore the notion that if you live here, you have full rights. And we need to have a much more robust system of allowing people into the country. And I think that, back to the German example, the Germans brought in 1 million refugees from the Syrian Middle East crisis several years ago. From what I can tell, in many ways, it's a resounding success. Germany is a country a fraction the size of the United States. How many refugees did we bring in from that war that we created? We created this catastrophe that sent hundreds of millions of people into despair. And what? We allowed 10,000, 15,000 refugees from that part of the world in a year. So we need to be more imaginative. We need to be more creative. We also need to be, we need to solve the legal structures to end this sort of dual status situation. Everyone who lives here should have full rights. So exactly, and I don't think that that's that complicated. I think that part is doable.
And you think this viewpoint can be sold? I mean, imagine if you had a review, a version of the Claremont Review.
Well, I mean,
you had very clever people writing clever articles. So do you think this idea could be sold to both the constituency of notables and also the constituency of the working class?
Well, I think that there are two pieces. And I think that if you look at polling, immigration reform is very popular. And there are two things that people really like about it. One is, there's a section of like people who want just a wall, and keep people out. But equally popular, maybe even more popular, is some route to legalization for the undocumented. And we don't pay enough attention to that. That has been, stonewalled by the Republicans in Congress. That doesn't get anywhere. But most Americans very much want that. They recognize that it's a problem. And I think if we leaned into that more strongly, I think we'd have something to sell.
Well, you're giving me a lot to think about, especially with regard to Poland. I got to sit and process that. Let me ask you one more perverse question. Then I'll try to ask some kind of a wholesome question. But here's another perverse one. A lot of people on the left have been kicking around, and not just in this country, people all over. People in Russia have been kicking around this idea that a lot of progress for the things that people on the left want is being accomplished by a politics of the right. And so there is some reason for a left-right, some kind of left-right consensus about something. What do you think about those sort of thoughts?
Tony, could you be more specific?
It's a very theoretical question.
Yeah, can you be more specific? Can you root it in a time and place that I can understand it better?
Okay, well, but I don't have to be so specific.
Okay.
How about foreign policy? Some foreign policy question. That could be anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, the foreign policy question is really interesting. I mean, you see Rachel Maddow doing all this stuff about prequel and the support, the breadth of support for Hitler in the United States prior to World War II and even into World War II. It's really interesting stuff. One of the things that I think that she doesn't give enough play to is that many of the people who were in the America First Committee and who really wanted to keep the United States out of the war were on the left or the middle.
Mhm.
You know,
Who-
they
who's
weren't.
Charles Beard kind of people?
Yeah, but a lot of those people were. Uh, you know, so
Yeah, and given on a given foreign policy question, presumably
so
anybody,
yeah.
anybody could have any opinion, presumably.
Well, but I think though that I think that there is a a sort of a. I think that the idea of that you can have intersections of common interest, yes, perfectly plausible.
A lovely phrase.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's perfectly possible. But if you think about if you remove the American First Committee and think about it more broadly, the pacifists and the social Christians who were opposed to the American entry into World War II had a profoundly different reason for their opposition than the Charles Lindberghs. The
Yeah,
Charles Lindberghs really did want to see Hitler march on across Europe, and
side, yeah.
yeah, and the Social Democrats really wanted to prevent a repeat of the Holocaust of the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
So so I think that in politics there are all kinds of intersections, but I think it's important to keep in mind that there really is a difference between the left and the right. I think just to bring this discussion around to the populism question, I think that's the reason why I object to the term most strongly. Populism obscures the fact that there is a difference between left and right. Right? The left is a striving for social equality, for the equality of humans, and the right is for the consolidation of hierarchical subjugation of some humans by others. That's the difference between left and right.
Hmm.
And I'm taking Norberto Bobbio here, but there are many other ways to put it. But that is the essential thing, and that's what the word populism obscures.
Mm-hmm.
That and that's why we should be talking not about populism in terms of MAGA, but right-wing nationalism. That's what it is,
Mm-hmm.
or conservative nationalism, whatever you want to call it. But it's not populism, because that obscures this real fundamental difference. And I think that difference also applies to foreign policy. But if you think about foreign policy and what advances human equality versus what advances the subjugation of some humans by others, and there's a reason why Israel is the darling of the far right everywhere, because it's one of the most glaring examples of one section of the population subjugating, in an extraordinary way, the other half of the population. And I think that's why it's such a cause. And I think we can think about foreign policy in those terms.
Well, I can't think of anybody who would explicate populism and what it really means. I can't think of anybody who would do it better than you do. If you can, if you're not embarrassed by the unctuous
No.
So thanks
Yeah.
thanks to Charles Shapiro for a very illuminating and, in my opinion, for me especially, thought-provoking discussion of these issues. Fascinating stuff, and we could go on for hours over a glass of tea. And unless you have a final statement, do you want to make a final summation of all of these arguments?
I think I said what I had to say. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
You definitely. Yeah. So I guess we're permitted then to conclude. Thanks to Charles Postel for an very illuminating discussion. And goodbye until next time, when we will continue to ask the question, after we've tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?